the angels, and these are the messengers and the servants of the divine council themselves. Now, the humans can get involved as becoming messengers as well as becoming sons of God. And Heiser says in his doctoral dissertation, this New Testament theme of the sons of God has this council as the substratum worldview that the Jews had in Jesus' day. I think that's fascinating. So I'm on page 46. Now I'm on page 47 of Osler's book. He says, what are we to make of the correspondence between the biblical Hebrew and the Ugaritic texts? The majority position is probably represented by Mark Smith. Now here is where, and Mark Smith certainly is one of the leading scholars in this particular area. William G. Dever has brought out some information, E. Theodore Mullen Jr. Now we can add Michael Heiser and David Bokovoy. David Bokovoy is coming up. Daniel C. Peterson has explored some information. And now, of course, no question, Blake Osler's in on this. This idea that pre-kingship Israelite religion included a belief of many gods that more or less mirrored the Ugaritic pantheon. This is based upon the model of the patriarchal family. Originally, the father god El, or Elyon. He was worshipped as the god in Israel. El united with his consort Atherat to beget the sons of God. In the second stage of development, El was the head of the Baal, or El was the head of the early Israelite pantheon, and Yahweh was its warrior god, comparable to Baal in the Ugaritic texts. These sons of the god El were placed by El to oversee the various nations, and this is where Yahweh was given Israel. So Yahweh is Israel's God. So El and Yahweh, it is postulated, were separate deities. Now this is one of the contentions that Michael Heiser disagrees with. It's kind of interesting how he analyzes this. Over time, as Israel came to identify its local deity as the dominant god, is when El and Yahweh merged, and only Yahweh remained as Israel's God. The primitive polytheism gradually gave way to a pure form of monotheism in the post-exilic era, when the other deities, the Elim or the Elohim, these in the council of the gods were eliminated. Now this is Mark Smith's evolutionary formula. This is precisely what Heiser argued against, and I actually thought he made a pretty good argument. The council of the gods never did disappear. Now it's interesting that about 621 BC, the Deuteronomists redacted the Israelite texts to remove references to other gods, and at the same time Josiah purged Israel of the various high places, Shechem, Jerusalem, so on, where the other gods were worshipped and this worship was practiced. And a pure monotheism in which Yahweh alone is recognized as God emerged in the exilic period in the writings of 2nd Isaiah. Osler asks a very powerful question, however. He recognized, as Heiser did, that the inconsistency here, this is on page 49, Osler says, if monotheism is not inconsistent with a head or the highest god that presides over a council of the gods, then why do the scholars deny that Second Temple Judaism could adopt the view of the divine council of the gods because of the fear that monotheism would be compromised? Here's the problem. They say the council of the gods was done away with to bring in monotheism. But they also say this council of the gods is not an argument against monotheism. That's kind of an interesting situation, isn't it? And I want to share some of the scholars that he uses. Huibray and Mark Smith, of course, and several others discussing this implication, this idea of monotheism, especially in 2nd Isaiah. Very important book dealing with monotheism there. So on page 48, Osler is discussing Mark Smith's idea on monotheism. He says, at first glance, Israelite monotheism would seem theoretically to stand at odds with the imagery of the Israelite assembly with its multiplicity of divinities, even if they are minor or are subservient to Yahweh as their absolute king. In fact, The divine assembly is not oppositional to monotheistic statements in biblical literature. For example, it is commonly held by biblical scholars that the opening of 2nd Isaiah, this is Isaiah chapter 40, involves a divine council scene. There are multitudinous deities involved in Isaiah chapter 40. It's interesting, isn't it? Yet this chapter is part of a larger work that contains the greatest number of monotheistic statements in the Bible. Divine council language and scenes also appear in the priestly work of the Pentateuch and post-exilic books, that is, in Zechariah and Daniel. And these are assumedly monotheistic. In other words, monotheism requires one divine assembly, headed by one divine ruler, but it makes little or no impact on the language of the assembly of the gods themselves. Fascinating, isn't it? Now he quotes Wybray in his study of the emergence of monotheism in 2nd Isaiah. Here's what Wybray says, A-R-N Wybray. It has recently been convincingly argued that side by side with 2nd Isaiah's uncompromising monotheism, there are clear indications that he retained a belief in the Israelite concept of Yahweh's heavenly counsel. The concept of Yahweh as possessed of unlimited power, far from leaving him in isolation, actually requires as a corollary to that, like any human king, he would have at his command a body or a group of servants and messengers attending upon him, carrying out his commands. The use of the term monotheism to describe Deutero-Isaiah's teaching has tended to obscure this idea here, and wrongly isolate him from his historical context in the history of Israelite religion as if he were an entirely new phenomenon, a Greek philosopher born before his time. There's no evidence for such a view. He was concerned rather to preserve the traditional Israelite view of God than to introduce novelties. Wybray is calling monotheism the novelty here. The real belief, according to Isaiah, is not just one God. It is this council of the gods. That's fascinating, isn't it? Well, if monotheism, now I'm back on page 49 of Osler, if monotheism is not really challenged by the existence of other gods, then why is it compromised or weakened if it is admitted that there are actually other gods, subordinated to the Most High God? The answer, it seems to me, is that even these preeminent scholars carry with them the baggage of an implicit assumption of metaphysical monotheism, defined by the metaphysical monotheism. These gods cannot really be of the same kind of being as the one God or as the God Most High, because the one God is the creator of all that exists, and these other gods are not. Smith argues that in discussing monotheism, one must exclude the reality of the other gods. And Michael Heiser really refutes this argument powerfully. Blake Osler, here in his book, he refutes this argument very powerfully. Why is it that if there only remains one God who is recognized as worthy of worship and as the ultimate sovereign king, it seems to me that Mark S. Smith assumes that these other heavenly beings must be of a different order ontologically, or else they compromise monotheism. Thus, to admit that there are gods in any real sense, and not merely pretenders to be gods, but to admit that there really are gods, is to weaken monotheism or to deny it altogether. But this isn't what happens in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's not what happens in the Christian Scriptures either. Isn't that a fascinating thing? You see the scholarly assumption when they bring in this later theological construct of monotheism. It messes everything up. The ideology, the theology, the actual worship and worldview paradigm of the entire ancient Near East, not just the Old Testament, but of several of the other literatures that have been discovered archaeologically, the worldview is a council of the gods, and they take that literally. God